Have you ever chased something so intensely, success, love, admiration, only to realize that the moment you finally grabbed it, it slipped through your fingers like air? That feeling, that endless hunger, is the entire life of Julian Sorel. Few characters in classic literature capture the depth and conflict of the human spirit like Julian, the protagonist of Stendhal's The Red and the Black. Julian is young, ambitious, intelligent, and painfully aware of the smallness of the world he was born into. Raised in a provincial town as the son of a harsh carpenter, he felt from a very early age the weight of being insignificant. But he refused to accept the destiny society had prepared for him. He believed life had to be more than obedience and hard labor. While others around him lived quietly, Julian devoured books about Napoleon, not as myths or distant legends, but as a promise that greatness was possible even for someone born invisible. He wanted to rise, not out of greed, but because greatness felt like the only escape from the silence that surrounded him. And yet, the greatness he chased wasn't only social. It was something internal, something he couldn't fully explain, a hunger that lived inside him. Pleasure became the shape that hunger took, the pleasure of power, of being admired, of conquering hearts. When he became the tutor of Madame de Renal's children, his life changed quickly. His intelligence and striking presence made him someone she noticed, someone she desired. Julian didn't love her, but he loved the power her attention gave him. Seducing her felt like a victory against the very society that had tried to erase him. But the victory didn't last. The pleasure faded fast, leaving him with the same emptiness as before. He needed more. He needed something higher, louder, more impossible. That is when he turned to Mathilde de la Mole, the daughter of a powerful aristocrat. She was cold, brilliant, refined, everything Madame de Renal wasn't. Winning Mathilde meant stepping into a world he had always been denied. Julian threw himself into this pursuit with the same intensity he brought to everything, but something inside him began to shift. The more he achieved, the more hollow he felt. Pleasure kept slipping away, always arriving as a brief flash followed by an even deeper dissatisfaction. Every time he reached the horizon, it moved further from him. His world fell apart when his past with Madame de Renal resurfaced, and in a moment of desperation, he attempted to kill her. He failed, was arrested, judged, and sentenced to die by guillotine. Only in those final days did he finally sit still long enough to understand his own life. He realized that his pursuit of pleasure had never been a search for happiness. It had been a way to escape himself. Julian Sorel died young, but his story survives because the trap he fell into is still the trap so many fall into today. Pleasure, when treated as the final goal, becomes a prison. His life forces us to ask, what is really driving us? Neuroscience has tried to answer this question, and when we examine Julian's life through that lens, it becomes obvious that he was trapped in the brain's reward system. Every time he gained admiration, seduced someone, or rose socially, his brain released dopamine, creating a rush of excitement and worthiness. But the brain adapts fast. What once felt incredible soon becomes ordinary, a phenomenon called hedonic adaptation. Julian lived inside the cycle. Every win lost its flavor, every thrill faded, and every victory demanded a new one. Modern research shows that our brains respond not just to rewards, but to the anticipation of new ones. Julian wasn't addicted to pleasure, he was addicted to the chase. His brain constantly whispered, "What's the next step?" But beneath all of this was something more vulnerable, the desperate need to be seen. Psychology teaches that once basic needs are met, humans seek validation, meaning, significance. Julian didn't want pleasure. He wanted to matter. He wanted proof that he wasn't the invisible boy his town told him he was. And yet the more he chased admiration, the more he lost himself. The applause was brief. The emptiness remained. His victories dissolved into disappointment. And the more he conquered, the more he felt like nothing. In that confusion, he ruined relationships, manipulated people, and ultimately destroyed himself. But if Julian had understood his own mind, would his story have changed? That question leads into the next part, where philosophy helps us understand what pleasure really is and why chasing it may never lead to happiness. From the very beginning of philosophy, humans have tried to answer one impossible question. Is pleasure the road to happiness, or is it just an illusion that keeps us chasing something we can never hold? Julian Sorel's life feels like it was written specifically to explore this question. He believed every victory, every conquest, every moment of admiration would finally give him peace. Yet, every time he reached what he thought he wanted, he found only a deeper emptiness waiting for him. And that is where philosophy steps in to explain what Julian himself could never understand. Take Epicurus, for example, a thinker often misunderstood. Many assume he encouraged people to seek wild, intense pleasures, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Epicurus taught that real happiness comes from simplicity, balance, and the absence of unnecessary pain. True pleasure for him wasn't in grand achievements, but in a quiet mind. Julian lived the complete opposite. He pursued pleasure like someone trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. The more he achieved, the more he burned from the inside. Every great conquest only created a bigger emptiness when the thrill disappeared. Then there is Schopenhauer, who saw life as an endless cycle of desire, struggle, and disappointment. According to him, humans are trapped in a loop. We want something, we suffer until we get it, and when we finally obtain it, we realize it didn't bring the happiness we expected. And so the desire shifts to something else, starting the cycle all over again. Julian is a perfect example of this. He wanted status, then love, then power, then admiration, then something even bigger. Even when he achieved these things, the satisfaction was fleeting. It was like drinking salt water. The more he consumed, the more thirsty he became. Another thinker, Ruben Alves, suggested that too many choices, too many desires, and too much stimulation numb the soul. We become so obsessed with what comes next that we forget how to feel what's happening now. Julian lived in exactly that state. He never paused, never breathed, never looked inward. He was always running toward the next victory, trapped in the fantasy that the next one would finally make him whole. And then there's Nietzsche, perhaps the philosopher who would have shaken Julian the most. Nietzsche warned that the greatest mistake a person can make is living according to values that are not their own. Julian never chased what he truly wanted. He chased what society told him was valuable. He wanted to prove he deserved respect. He wanted to prove he wasn't just the poor son of a carpenter. But all of this was an attempt to satisfy a world that didn't care about him. Nietzsche would say Julian failed not because he was weak, but because he was not authentic. He searched for pleasure to impress a society that secretly despised him for his origins. He fought a battle that was never his to fight. All these philosophical perspectives point to one painful truth. Pleasure becomes destructive when it becomes the ultimate goal. Instead of lifting us, it begins to punish us. Julian is the living image of that punishment. He dedicated his entire life to a pursuit that made him feel powerful for a moment and miserable for much longer. He confused intensity with meaning, applause with love, and achievement with purpose. And like a ship sailing without a compass, he moved forward until he crashed into the emptiness he carried inside. But to understand why Julian was so vulnerable to this endless chase, we must look deeper into him. Not at his ambition, but at his wounds, at his insecurities, at his desperate desire to be seen and valued. Philosophy shows us the mistake. Psychology reveals the reason. And that leads us into the next part, the psychological and emotional landscape that turned Julian into a prisoner of his own mind, shaped by fragile self-worth, old injuries, and the hunger for external validation. That inner battlefield is where Julian's tragedy truly begins. If we look closely at Julian Sorel's story, it becomes clear that his endless chase for pleasure wasn't just ambition. It was a deep psychological need. He didn't simply want to conquer people, he wanted to be seen. He wanted to matter. And this craving for validation is one of the most powerful forces driving human behavior, often pushing people into patterns that border on self-destruction. Psychology helps explain this through the theory of self-esteem, developed by Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology. Rogers believed that every person has a fundamental need to be accepted and valued by others. For Julien, his self-worth was tied directly to how much admiration he could collect. He didn't believe he had value simply for existing. He believed he had value only when others looked at him with desire or respect. This belief made him extremely vulnerable to the opinions of the world around him. Social psychology calls this the trap of comparison. Julien grew up in a society where status determined everything: your opportunities, your relationships, even your dignity. He constantly compared himself to nobles and wealthy families, always feeling inferior, always feeling like he had to prove he belonged. And every time he felt that sting of inferiority, he threw himself into a new conquest, hoping it would erase the shame he carried from childhood. Neuroscience adds another layer to this. Studies show that social rejection activates the same brain regions associated with physical pain. In other words, being ignored, underestimated, or dismissed literally hurts. For Julien, who was mocked and belittled by his own family, this pain was familiar. He spent his entire life trying to avoid feeling it again. He chased the opposite feeling, the rush of being admired, envied, desired. But the brain has a cruel twist. The pleasure of recognition doesn't last. Our reward system adapts quickly. The applause that once felt euphoric eventually becomes normal, even expected. This is known as hedonic tolerance, and it means we need bigger and bigger rewards to feel the same level of satisfaction. Julien lived trapped in this loop. Every accomplishment lost its shine almost immediately, pushing him to chase the next one: a new romance, a higher social rank, a bigger display of power. This cycle is everywhere in modern life. Think of someone who checks their phone every few minutes, looking for likes or messages. The first notification feels amazing, but soon 1 isn't enough. Then 10 aren't enough, then 100 aren't enough. Or think of people who keep buying new things, hoping the next purchase will finally make them feel fulfilled. Like Julien, they discovered that the satisfaction fades quickly and the emptiness returns just as fast. Psychology also shows how childhood trauma shapes adult behavior. Julien grew up in a home where he was constantly insulted and rejected by his father and brothers. They saw him as weak, strange, useless. That early humiliation carved a scar into him that he tried to hide behind every accomplishment. He wasn't chasing pleasure. He was trying to heal a wound he didn't know how to face. But instead of healing, he kept reopening it. Each new conquest was like a bandage that fell off within moments, revealing the same old pain underneath. Neuroscience further reveals that too many rewards, too frequently, can destabilize the reward system of the brain. When we push for constant stimulation, social validation, romantic attention, high achievement, it can lead to compulsive behavior. Julien demonstrated exactly that. He became reckless, willing to risk everything: relationships, status, even his life, just to preserve the fragile sense of superiority and validation he depended on. And what does all this teach us? Psychology shows that real self-esteem cannot be built from external applause. It must come from within, from a stable sense of identity, from accepting our flaws and limitations rather than trying to outrun them. Julien never understood that. His search for validation was really a search for himself, a search he never stopped long enough to complete. His life became a mirror of what happens when we let external approval define our internal worth. And this brings us into the final part: how Julien's story reflects our modern world and the everyday ways we fall into the same traps he did. In our relationships, our careers, our online lives, his tragedy quietly repeats itself in millions of people who chase fleeting pleasure while losing sight of who they really are. After exploring philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, it becomes clear that Julien Sorel's story is not just a tale from another century. It is a mirror held up to the world we live in today. We exist in a culture built around instant gratification. If you want food, you order it. If you want validation, you post something online and wait for the likes. If you want distraction, you scroll for hours through endless content. These conveniences give us small bursts of pleasure,
but they also reveal how addicted we've become to the constant chase. Think about social media. Each like, comment, or message triggers a spike of dopamine in the brain, the same chemical that fuels rewards like food and sex. But just like Julien discovered with his social victories, the rush fades almost instantly. So we post again, scroll again, refresh again. Eventually, the pleasure becomes less about enjoyment and more about avoiding the silence that comes when the phone stops buzzing. This cycle shows up in consumerism too. Julien chased social status to feel valuable, and today many people chase material possessions for the same reason. The newest phone, the flashiest car, the trendiest clothes. These things become symbols of identity, badges that supposedly prove we matter. But when the novelty fades, as it always does, we're left needing something even bigger to fill the emptiness. Relationships aren't immune to this trap either. In a world where dating can be as simple as swiping right, many people drift from one connection to the next, searching for excitement rather than intimacy. Julien treated relationships the same way, as stepping stones to validation, not as spaces for mutual care. He mistook intensity for love. Many people today do the same, confusing emotional highs for emotional depth. Even in work, the pursuit of pleasure and validation can quietly take over. We are told that success is everything. We chase titles, promotions, recognition, hoping that reaching the top will finally bring fulfillment. But Julien's rise showed the opposite. When you chase status for the wrong reasons, even the highest place feels empty. And just like Julien, many people sacrifice their mental health, their relationships, and their sense of self in the pursuit of achievements that never deliver what they promise. The mental cost of this lifestyle is enormous. Anxiety, depression, and burnout all thrive in environments where people are constantly running, constantly comparing, constantly trying to impress. Pleasure becomes a drug, something we expect to rescue us from our own dissatisfaction. But the more we rely on it, the more fragile we become. Julien Sorel is the tragic illustration of where this path leads. His obsession with pleasure and validation didn't make him stronger, it made him hollow. It stripped him of peace, clarity, and eventually his life. His story warns us that living only for pleasure is like running on a treadmill that never stops speeding up. You move faster, try harder, push more intensely, but you never arrive anywhere. And in that chase, you lose sight of the things that actually matter: inner growth, genuine connection, authentic meaning. So what can we take from Julien's fall? Not a step-by-step guide to happiness. This is not that kind of story. But a moment of reflection. What actually makes us feel alive? Is it the temporary approval of others, or the quiet satisfaction of knowing who we are? Is it the fleeting rush of pleasure, or the steady sense of living according to our own values? Julien never asked himself these questions. He never paused long enough to breathe, to reflect, to confront the pain he carried. He kept running until the chase consumed him completely. His life is a warning. Pleasure without awareness becomes a prison, and inside that prison, it becomes easy to forget how to live fully, deeply, honestly. In the end, the search for pleasure is not wrong. Pleasure is part of being human. The danger lies in believing that pleasure alone will save us. Julien Sorel learned this too late. We don't have to. And if this story made you reflect or helped you see something in your own life differently, then share it with someone who needs it. Sometimes a single idea is enough to break the cycle and help us step off the treadmill we never realized we were on.